The most expensive gate I ever owned wasn't the one with the steel frame. It was the one my HOA president couldn't resist cutting open. The sharp whine of a cordless angle grinder sliced through the cool morning air before the sun had fully cleared the pine trees surrounding my lake. I froze halfway through pouring my first cup of coffee, the rich smell mixing with the faint scent of wet cedar drifting in through my kitchen window. That metallic grinding sound didn't belong out there. I knew every noise around this property. The loons calling across the water, the slow splash of bass breaking the surface near the dock. Even the old hinges on my grandfather's boathouse had their own familiar groan. But steel screaming against steel at 6:18 on a Tuesday morning? That meant someone had crossed a line. I grabbed my keys and headed outside, gravel crunching beneath my boots as the sound grew louder with every step toward the private access road leading to my lake. When I rounded the last bend, I found exactly what I feared, and somehow it was even worse. Standing beside my locked lake access gate was Margaret Ashcroft, president of Willow Ridge Estates HOA, wearing an immaculate designer golf outfit in bright pink, oversized sunglasses that cost more than most people's monthly utility bill, and enough gold jewelry to flash like a traffic signal whenever she moved her arm. Two landscaping contractors stood beside her while sparks sprayed across the morning shadows. One of them was cutting through the heavy chain securing my gate. Maggie never even looked surprised to see me. She simply folded her arms, smiled like she was posing for a magazine cover, and nodded toward the grinder. "Good morning, Caleb," she said in that syrupy voice people use when they're absolutely convinced they're the smartest person in the room. "We're solving a community access problem." Behind her, nearly a dozen golf carts had already lined up along the road. Pickup trucks towing fishing boats idled patiently. Families carrying coolers chatted like they were waiting for a theme park to open. Someone had even brought inflatable paddleboards. They all stared at my gate as though it had always belonged to them. Then the chain snapped. The lock hit the gravel with a heavy clang that echoed across the lake. One of the contractors pushed the gate wide open while Maggie stepped aside with a theatrical sweep of her arm, welcoming everyone through as if she had just opened the entrance to a brand new county park. Tires rolled over my private road. Boat trailers rattled past me. Kids laughed. Fishing poles bounced in truck beds. The smell of gasoline mixed with fresh-cut grass and lake water as vehicle after vehicle crossed my property without asking permission. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I didn't even move. I simply watched. Maggie caught my expression and mistook it for defeat. I could practically see her confidence growing with every truck that disappeared toward the shoreline. "You really should have worked with the community instead of against it," she said, adjusting the expensive scarf tied around her neck. "This lake has been sitting here benefiting only one homeowner." "That's selfish, Caleb. We fixed the problem." Fixed. Interesting choice of words. Because what she had actually done was much more expensive than opening a gate. Far more expensive than replacing a lock. The cool morning breeze carried the faint smell of engine exhaust as another SUV towing a baseboat rolled through the entrance. I glanced down at the broken chain lying at my feet. My grandfather used to polish that lock every spring before fishing season. He always joked that some people thought ownership was about fences. "It isn't," he'd tell me while tightening the bolts on that very gate. "Ownership is about paperwork nobody bothers to read." At the time, I thought he was talking about property deeds. Standing there watching nearly 30 strangers drive across my land, I finally realized he meant something much bigger. Maggie believed she had just created free access to the most beautiful private lake in the county. In reality, every golf cart, every pickup truck, every fishing boat, every single person who crossed that gate had unknowingly triggered the same forgotten legal clause. And by the time the sun set over that water, each trip would carry a price tag of $480,000. I should probably tell you why that gate mattered so much to me. Because from the outside it looked like nothing more than 40 feet of black steel stretched between two weathered limestone columns. To everyone else, it was simply the entrance to a beautiful lake tucked behind a line of towering pines in northern Wisconsin. To my family, it was the last promise my grandfather ever asked me to keep. My name is Caleb Walker. I am 38 years old, and I make my living designing water control systems for reservoirs, flood mitigation projects, and municipal infrastructure throughout the Midwest. Most weeks I spend more time wearing work boots than dress shoes, studying survey maps instead of office presentations. Numbers make sense to me. Elevations make sense. Contracts make sense. People, on the other hand, have a remarkable talent for ignoring every line they do not want to read. My grandfather, Harold Walker, understood that better than anyone. He bought this property in 1969, long before luxury subdivisions surrounded the shoreline. Back then, the lake was quiet enough that you could hear an outboard motor from 3 miles away. He cleared the access road himself with an old bulldozer that leaked hydraulic fluid almost as fast as it burned diesel. Every cedar post along that road had passed through his hands. Every stone lining the entrance had been hauled in with his tractor, one bucket at a time. By the time I was old enough to walk beside him, the road had become our Saturday classroom. While other kids learned baseball statistics, I learned property markers, easements, shoreline regulations, and why a survey monument mattered more than a fence. I still remember the smell of fresh sawdust every spring when he repaired the dock after winter ice drifted across the shoreline. He always carried a yellow legal pad folded inside his jacket pocket. On one side, he kept grocery lists. On the other side, he wrote notes about deeds, permits, maintenance records, and every agreement involving the property. At the time, I thought he was simply organized. Years later, I realized he was building something much stronger than a cabin. He was building a paper trail that could survive generations. When he passed away, the lake became mine. Not because I was the oldest grandson, but because I was the only one who actually wanted the responsibility that came with it. My cousins preferred beach vacations and condominium pools. I preferred quiet mornings listening to wind move through pine branches while coffee steamed in my hands. I never built a mansion, never turned the shoreline into a resort. The cabin stayed almost exactly the way my grandfather left it. The old cedar porch still creaked near the third step. The weather vane still squeaked every time the wind shifted from the west. Even the faded tackle box sitting beneath the workbench remained exactly where he had placed it 20 years earlier. Then Willow Ridge Estates arrived. What had once been farmland slowly transformed into rows of expensive homes with decorative streetlights, identical mailboxes, and carefully manicured lawns that always looked freshly trimmed. The subdivision itself never bothered me. Families deserve good neighborhoods. Children deserve safe streets. But somewhere along the way, the Homeowners Association stopped believing its job was maintaining common areas and started believing it owned everything people could see. That was where Margaret Ashcroft came in. She had been elected HOA president 3 years before I met her, and according to nearly every contractor, surveyor, and county employee I knew, she had developed a reputation for confusing confidence with authority. She drove a pearl-white luxury sport utility vehicle that never seemed to have a speck of dust on it, dressed as though every grocery trip required country club attire, and treated every conversation like a board meeting where she had already cast the deciding vote. During our first conversation, she smiled warmly, complimented the lake, admired the trees, and casually suggested that opening private access for the neighborhood would improve community spirit. I thanked her for the idea and politely declined. Her smile never disappeared, but something behind it changed. It became measured, calculating, like someone quietly revising a blueprint. Over the following months, I noticed survey stakes appearing suspiciously close to my property line before disappearing a day later. Delivery drivers occasionally asked why the neighborhood map showed my access road as though it connected to the subdivision. Even strangers walking their dogs would sometimes stop at the gate and ask when the community entrance would finally open. Each question seemed harmless by itself. Together, they formed a picture I did not fully understand yet. Looking back now, every conversation, every misplaced map, every polite suggestion was another small step leading toward the sound that woke me that Tuesday morning. None of it happened by accident, and neither, as I would soon discover, did what happened next. Margaret Ashcroft had an unusual gift for making unreasonable ideas sound perfectly civilized. If you met her for 5 minutes at a charity fundraiser, you would probably describe her as polished, generous, and deeply invested in her community. She remembered birthdays, sent handwritten thank you cards, organized holiday decorating contests, and somehow always managed to appear in the local newspaper standing beside oversized donation checks. That carefully polished image was exactly why so many people underestimated her. They never saw what happened after the cameras disappeared. I did. The first official letter from the Homeowners Association arrived less than 3 weeks after I declined her invitation to discuss opening the lake. The envelope smelled faintly of expensive stationery and fresh printer ink. Inside was a friendly reminder asking me to consider becoming a participating recreational partner with Willow Ridge Estates. It praised my stewardship of the property before explaining that shared lake access would increase neighborhood unity. I read every page twice before placing it in the same filing cabinet where my grandfather had stored documents for decades. I answered politely, "Thank you for your proposal." I respectfully declined. That should have been the end of the conversation. Instead, it became the beginning of a campaign. A month later, brightly colored brochures started appearing throughout the subdivision, showing smiling families kayaking across what was unmistakably my shoreline. The wording never directly claimed the lake belonged to the neighborhood, but it carefully suggested that future recreational opportunities were being developed for residents. At first, I assumed it was simply overly optimistic marketing. Then contractors I had known for years began calling me with strange questions. One surveyor asked whether I had approved a preliminary community trail connecting to my access road. A utility engineer wondered if I planned to widen the entrance for increased traffic. Even the owner of the local marina asked when the Homeowners Association would begin issuing seasonal launch permits. Every conversation ended the same way. I told them no such agreement existed. They sounded genuinely surprised. Meanwhile, Maggie continued smiling every time we crossed paths. She never raised her voice, never threatened me directly. She simply repeated the same carefully rehearsed phrase. Communities grow when resources are shared. On paper, those words sounded harmless. In practice, they became an excuse for crossing boundaries that had existed for more than 50 years. One Saturday morning, I arrived at the gate and found fresh blue paint marking the edge of my gravel road. County survey paint uses orange. Utility companies use fluorescent green. This was neither. Someone had measured parking spaces along my private entrance as though preparations had already begun for weekend visitors. I washed the markings away with a garden hose, figuring some contractor had made an honest mistake. 2 weeks later, they appeared again. This time, there were small wooden stakes tied with bright ribbon stretching nearly 100 feet toward the shoreline. I removed those too. The following Monday, Maggie stopped by wearing oversized sunglasses, sparkling bracelets, and a floral jacket that looked more appropriate for a country club brunch than a rural lakeside road. She glanced toward the missing stakes without ever mentioning them directly. Then she smiled. "You know, Caleb, sometimes progress looks messy before everyone appreciates it." Her perfume lingered long after she climbed back into her white luxury sport utility vehicle. The sweet scent mixed strangely with the smell of pine needles warming beneath the afternoon sun, and for reasons I could not explain, it left me uneasy. My neighbor Frank noticed it too. Frank owned 80 acres bordering the northern edge of my property and had spent 40 years operating heavy equipment throughout the county. He had seen more land disputes than most attorneys. One evening, he leaned against my porch railing, sipping coffee while watching the sunset reflect across the water. Without taking his eyes off the lake, he quietly asked whether I had checked the newest county tourism brochure. I had not. The next morning, he handed me a folded copy. There, printed beside a photograph taken from my shoreline, was a caption describing future public-style lake amenities connected to Willow Ridge Estates. There was no announcement, no approval, no signature, just carefully chosen language designed to make an assumption feel like reality. Frank shook his head slowly. "People believe something after they read it often enough," he said. Eventually, they stopped asking whether it was ever true. That sentence stayed with me, because once enough residents believed they already had access, all it would take was one person willing to make that belief seem permanent. Maggie was patient. She understood that changing minds was easier than changing deeds. She only needed the neighborhood to accept her version of the story long enough for everyone to forget the real one. Unfortunately for her, my grandfather had spent half a century making sure the real story was preserved where opinions could never erase it. The turning point did not arrive with sirens or court papers. It arrived one ordinary Thursday afternoon wrapped inside a certified envelope that fit neatly into my mailbox. The paper inside was thick, expensive, and carried the official Willow Ridge Estates letterhead across the top. According to Maggie and her board, my private access road had now been designated an essential neighborhood connector for emergency recreational planning. I actually laughed when I read that phrase. Emergency recreational planning. Those 3 words somehow managed to sound official without meaning anything at all. The letter continued by informing me that I would be responsible for maintaining the gravel surface to community standards, trimming trees along both sides of the road, upgrading the entrance gate for increased public traffic, and contributing to future maintenance costs that I had never agreed to. They even included a payment schedule. At the bottom was Maggie's signature, perfectly centered in dark blue ink. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside every other document she had sent over the past year. My grandfather always said never throw away paperwork when someone else is writing your future for you. A few days later, another surprise appeared. Someone had installed a temporary wooden sign just outside my gate. It read, Future Community Lake Entrance. The lettering was professionally printed. Decorative arrows pointed toward my road. Fresh tire tracks covered the gravel where visitors had already started slowing down to read it. I removed the sign before sunset and stacked it beside my workshop. The next morning, another one appeared. This one was larger. I drove into town and visited the local print shop, whose logo appeared in tiny letters along the bottom corner. The owner looked genuinely uncomfortable when I asked who had ordered them. He apologized, explained that the Homeowners Association had described the project as approved community improvements, and promised he had no idea the entrance was private property. I thanked him, paid for coffee on my way out, and never blamed him for doing his job. People generally act on the information they are given. Maggie understood that better than anyone. By early summer, the situation became impossible to ignore. Families began stopping outside the gate every weekend. Some unloaded bicycles. Others walked to the fence carrying fishing rods while children pressed their faces between the steel bars hoping to glimpse the water. More than once I politely explained that the road and shoreline were private property. Most apologized immediately and turned around. Several admitted they had attended homeowners association meetings where future lake access had been discussed as though it were already guaranteed. None of them sounded dishonest. They sounded convinced. That was the dangerous part. A false assumption repeated often enough eventually begins to feel like a fact. Then came the maps. One afternoon, my friend Daniel, who worked for the county mapping office, called and asked whether I had requested a correction to my parcel information. I told him I had not. He quietly invited me to stop by after work. Spread across his desk was a draft planning exhibit submitted during a neighborhood improvement proposal. My access road had been highlighted in bright yellow and labeled Shared Community Corridor. Daniel tapped the page with one finger and frowned. "This is not an official county map," he said. "It came from a private submission. But if nobody challenges it, people will assume it reflects reality." As I drove home that evening, the smell of approaching rain drifted through my open truck window while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills. I pulled into my driveway just as the first drops began striking the windshield. Standing beside the gate was Maggie, perfectly dry beneath a large white umbrella despite the storm building overhead. She smiled as though we had accidentally met during a pleasant evening walk. "You are making this harder than it needs to be, Caleb," she said calmly. "The neighborhood has already accepted what is coming. You can either help shape it or stand in its way." I looked past her toward the locked gate, then beyond it to the quiet lake my grandfather had protected for decades. The water reflected the darkening sky without making a sound. I smiled politely, wished her a good evening, and drove through my gate without another word. She interpreted my silence as surrender. In truth, I had simply reached the point where listening became far more valuable than arguing. The following week was the first time I seriously wondered whether I was fighting a battle I could not win. Every morning seemed to introduce another small change that pushed the neighborhood one step closer to treating my property as though ownership had already changed hands. Fresh tire marks appeared near the entrance where unfamiliar vehicles had turned around after finding the gate locked. Handwritten notes asking when the lake would officially open were tucked beneath the windshield wipers of my truck whenever I parked in town. Even the local bait shop had started telling customers that public access would probably be available before the end of summer, because that was what people had been hearing around Willow Ridge Estates. Rumors have a strange momentum. Once enough people repeat the same story, the truth begins sounding like the unusual version. I decided it was finally time to involve professionals. The attorney I hired specialized in real estate disputes and spent nearly 2 hours reviewing surveys, deeds, tax records, and every letter Maggie had ever sent me. His office smelled of old leather chairs and fresh copier toner while rain tapped softly against the windows outside. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and told me something I did not want to hear. Legally, he believed my ownership was solid. Practically, he warned that proving every false representation, every misleading map, and every unauthorized action could take years if the situation escalated into full litigation. He recommended sending a formal cease and desist letter and avoiding unnecessary confrontation. It was careful advice, sensible advice. It also felt painfully slow. We mailed the letter that afternoon. Maggie responded 4 days later through the Homeowners Association attorney. Their reply denied every allegation, insisted that no trespassing had occurred, claimed all planning materials were merely conceptual discussions, and described the entire disagreement as an unfortunate misunderstanding between neighbors. Reading those words almost made me admire the strategy. Nothing was admitted. Nothing was denied in a way that could easily be disproved. Every sentence seemed designed to leave just enough room for interpretation. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued acting as though access was inevitable. One Saturday morning, I noticed several residents gathered outside the gate studying a laminated neighborhood map taped to a portable sign. Someone had highlighted my road in bright yellow marker. Parents pointed toward the lake while children bounced excitedly beside bicycles and fishing poles. When they noticed me approaching, most smiled politely and asked when construction would be finished. Construction? There had never been any construction. Only assumptions carefully fed over months until they sounded like confirmed facts. I calmly explained that the road remained private property and asked where they had received the map. Nearly everyone gave the same answer. The Homeowners Association meeting. Nobody argued with me. Nobody became angry. They simply looked confused, folded up the map, and left. That conversation bothered me more than any threatening letter. These families were not trying to take something from me. They honestly believed they had been promised something that already existed. Maggie had managed to place herself in the role of problem solver while quietly casting me as the obstacle standing in everyone's way. Even Frank admitted the situation had reached an uncomfortable point. We stood beside the dock one evening watching the water turn orange beneath the setting sun while dragonflies skimmed across the surface. He rested both hands on the weathered railing and quietly said, "You are not really arguing with the Homeowners Association anymore. You are arguing with a story people have already accepted." The breeze carried the smell of pine sap and cool lake water across the shoreline as his words settled in my mind. He was right. Facts alone were no longer enough. Perception had become part of the battlefield. That night, I unlocked the old filing cabinet my grandfather had built into the cabin wall decades earlier. Inside were hundreds of carefully labeled folders, faded engineering sketches, handwritten maintenance logs, survey plats, receipts, permits, and documents dating back longer than I had been alive. I ran my fingers across the worn folder tabs, remembering something he used to tell me whenever we finished repairing the dock each spring. People protect land with fences until someone tears the fence down. Smart people protect land with records because paper remembers everything. At the time, it sounded like another lesson from an old man who believed in saving every receipt. Sitting there beneath the warm glow of the cabin lights, surrounded by decades of forgotten paperwork, I began wondering whether he had left behind something far more valuable than memories. The cabin stayed quiet long after midnight, except for the steady ticking of the old wall clock and the soft rustle of papers sliding across my dining room table. Dust floated through the warm light above my grandfather's desk as I worked through file after file, each folder labeled in his careful block handwriting. Tax receipts, shoreline permits, survey revisions, maintenance records dating back to the early 1970s. Every document told part of the property's history, but none of them explained why he had guarded that gate with almost stubborn determination. Around 1:30 in the morning, I reached the bottom drawer, the one I rarely opened because it contained oversized engineering plans rolled inside weathered cardboard tubes. As I lifted them out, something thinner slipped behind the cabinet and landed on the hardwood floor with a dry crackle. It was an old brown envelope sealed with brittle tape and addressed in my grandfather's handwriting. Across the front, he had written only 6 words. Open only if access is challenged. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. My grandfather was never dramatic. If he wrote something down, there was always a reason. Inside the envelope were several folded legal documents, an original survey from 1969, handwritten correspondence with the previous owner of the neighboring ranch, and a notarized agreement attached to a detailed engineering exhibit showing the exact location of the access road, shoreline, and gate. I spread everything across the table, the smell of old paper mixing with fresh coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. At first, the language seemed painfully technical, full of easements, maintenance obligations, access limitations, and property descriptions measured down to fractions of an inch. Then one paragraph stopped me completely. Decades before Willow Ridge Estates ever existed, my grandfather and the surrounding landowner had negotiated a unique access covenant tied directly to the private road. The agreement did not prohibit others from using the entrance under every circumstance. Instead, it established that any commercial, organized, or unauthorized shared use required a separately negotiated access license. Without that license, each documented use constituted a compensable contractual violation under a liquidated damages provision that would automatically adjust according to the appraised commercial value of the surrounding waterfront property. I read the paragraph 3 times to make sure I was understanding it correctly. This was not a criminal penalty. It was not a government fine. It was not some mysterious loophole that magically punished trespassers. It was a private contractual provision attached to the property's chain of title, created decades earlier to discourage developers from converting the family access road into a community entrance without the owner's consent. The original amount listed in the agreement looked almost laughably small by today's standards. But attached behind it were later amendments and valuation schedules prepared whenever the surrounding parcels were refinanced or subdivided. The most recent appraisal update, completed only a few years before my grandfather passed away, reflected the explosive increase in lakefront property values. I pulled out my calculator and followed the adjustment formula exactly as described in the documents. The final figure appeared on the screen: $480,000. I stared at the number for several seconds, almost expecting I had entered something incorrectly. The next morning, I drove straight to Daniel at the county mapping office. He carefully examined every page before quietly recommending that I speak with the attorney who had originally prepared the recorded amendments, assuming he had retired by now. Fortunately, the law firm still existed, although under a different name. By noon, I was sitting across from one of the senior partners, while sunlight reflected across shelves filled with decades of property records. He read through the entire packet without interrupting once. Finally, he removed his glasses, smiled slightly, and said something I will never forget. "Your grandfather was remarkably thorough." He explained that the documents did not mean anyone who accidentally wandered onto the road automatically owed hundreds of thousands of dollars. The provision applied only if specific conditions were met, including organized unauthorized use after notice and documented evidence establishing repeated activity connected to an entity attempting to create shared access without obtaining the required license. In other words, everything depended on proof. Clear proof. Reliable proof. My mind immediately returned to Maggie's brochures, the planning exhibits, the temporary signs, the neighborhood meetings, and every carefully orchestrated step she had taken to convince people the entrance belonged to the community. For months I had believed she was simply trying to pressure me into giving up. Now I realized something else entirely. She had already built the perfect foundation for documenting exactly what the agreement required. I folded the papers back into their envelope with far more care than when I had opened them. For the first time since this entire dispute began, I stopped worrying about convincing Maggie that she was wrong. I no longer needed her permission to protect my property. I simply needed patience, accurate records, and the willingness to let her keep believing she was winning. Once I understood what those documents actually required, I stopped thinking like someone trapped in a neighborhood dispute and started thinking like the engineer my grandfather had trained me to become. Engineering is never about emotion. It is about observation, documentation, and repeatable results. Every conclusion has to be supported by evidence that can survive careful scrutiny. That was exactly how I intended to approach Maggie's campaign. I never replaced the broken chain immediately. Instead, I ordered a temporary locking system that looked almost identical from a distance, but allowed me to monitor every movement through the entrance without interfering with the ongoing situation. I also upgraded the security cameras my grandfather had installed years earlier. The old cameras had faithfully recorded weather, wildlife, and the occasional curious fisherman. The new system captured high-resolution video from multiple angles, complete with synchronized timestamps stored automatically in secure cloud backups. Every vehicle entering the road could be identified. Every trailer, every golf cart, every boat registration, every arrival and departure became part of a growing timeline. I even added a camera overlooking the shoreline where boats entered the water, along with another position near the old boathouse that quietly documented activity without intruding on anyone's privacy beyond my own property. Daniel helped me verify the exact property boundaries one more time using current county survey coordinates. Frank accompanied us as an independent witness while we photographed every monument, marker, and corner pin. The morning air smelled of damp earth after an overnight rain, and sunlight filtered through the tall pines as survey equipment clicked softly into place. We documented everything before anyone could later claim the road had somehow shifted or the boundaries had become uncertain. My attorney also advised me to maintain a daily property log. At first, the idea seemed excessive, but after only a week, I understood its value. Every morning, I noted the weather, the condition of the gate, the number of vehicles observed near the entrance, and any conversations involving lake access. If someone placed another sign near the road, it was photographed before being removed. If another brochure appeared in neighborhood mailboxes, I saved a clean copy. When residents politely asked about future access, I answered respectfully and made a brief note describing the conversation. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just facts recorded in chronological order. Meanwhile, Maggie became noticeably more confident. The temporary signs returned, this time mounted on heavier posts with decorative trim that matched the neighborhood entrance. Community volunteers occasionally gathered near the gate discussing future cleanup days and shoreline improvements as though planning a public park. Someone even distributed a calendar announcing an upcoming lake opening celebration scheduled for the first Saturday of the following month. The invitation listed music, food trucks, kayaking demonstrations, and family fishing activities. My private access road appeared on the event map as the primary entrance. I kept a copy of that flyer as well. The most surprising part was how many people genuinely believed everything had already been approved. Several homeowners stopped by my cabin carrying homemade pies or fresh vegetables from their gardens, introducing themselves as future lake neighbors. They were kind people, honest people. More than once I explained that the road remained private property and that no access agreement had ever been signed. Most looked sincerely confused. A few apologized for the misunderstanding. Others quietly admitted Maggie had repeatedly assured everyone that the remaining paperwork was merely a formality. Those conversations mattered because they revealed something important. The residents were not creating this narrative themselves. They had been relying on representations made by someone they trusted. I never argued with them. I simply thanked them for stopping by and documented the date, time, and substance of each discussion. As the announced celebration approached, activity around the entrance increased almost daily. Delivery trucks dropped off portable picnic tables at the neighborhood clubhouse. Decorative banners appeared along subdivision streets featuring cheerful lake-themed artwork. Contractors measured traffic flow near the entrance, apparently preparing for larger crowds. Every step reinforced the same message. Maggie believed the story had already become reality. She had invested months persuading everyone that the gate represented nothing more than an outdated obstacle waiting to disappear. Standing on my porch one quiet evening, listening to frogs calling across the calm water while the last orange light settled over the lake, I looked toward the gate in the distance and realized something almost ironic. I no longer needed to prove that Maggie intended to create unauthorized community access. She was documenting that intention herself, one meeting, one brochure, one event, and one conversation at a time. All I had to do was keep preserving the record with the same quiet patience my grandfather had practiced for decades. Because sooner or later someone convinced they could ignore the paperwork usually makes the mistake of creating even more of it. The first Saturday of the month arrived exactly the way Maggie had promised the neighborhood it would. By 7 o'clock that morning, the quiet road leading toward my lake had transformed into a steady procession of pickup trucks pulling fishing boats, golf carts carrying coolers, families unloading folding chairs, and bicycles weaving carefully between parked vehicles. The air smelled of fresh coffee, sunscreen, and newly cut grass while laughter drifted through the pine trees. Colorful balloons decorated the temporary signs pointing toward my entrance. Someone had even placed a banner near the subdivision clubhouse welcoming everyone to what it called the first annual Community Lake Day. I stood on my porch holding a mug of black coffee, watching everything unfold through binoculars more out of habit than necessity. Every camera on the property displayed a crisp live image across the monitors inside my cabin. Every vehicle entering the access road automatically received a timestamp. Every trailer, every license plate visible from public view, every organized activity connected to the event became part of the same uninterrupted record. I never interrupted anyone. I never confronted anyone. My attorney had made one request that sounded almost too simple. Let the facts develop naturally. Around 8:30, Maggie arrived wearing another bright designer outfit, oversized sunglasses, and a broad smile that suggested she believed the entire morning marked a personal victory. She greeted residents, posed for photographs beside the entrance, and thanked volunteers for helping create what she proudly described as a lasting community tradition. Several people applauded. A local real estate agent recorded short promotional videos highlighting the beautiful lake lifestyle now available to prospective buyers. Those words caught my attention. Available. Community. Access. Each statement quietly reinforced the same representation that had appeared for months in brochures, meetings, and neighborhood conversations. By noon, the shoreline looked busier than I had ever seen it. Canoes floated across the water. Families spread picnic blankets beneath the trees. Children skipped stones near the dock while parents relaxed beneath portable shade tents. Most of them had absolutely no idea they were standing inside the middle of a complicated property dispute. They believed they had been invited somewhere they were entitled to enjoy. I never blamed them. My concern remained focused on the people who had created that belief. Throughout the afternoon, my attorney and an independent investigator observed activity from locations outside the property, documenting public signs, promotional materials, organized parking assistance, and the homeowners association volunteers directing traffic toward my private entrance. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was staged. The day simply unfolded exactly as Maggie had planned it. Late that evening, after the last truck disappeared down the county road and the familiar silence slowly returned to the lake, I locked the cabin, backed up every video file in multiple locations, and delivered copies of the complete documentation package to my attorney. The evidence filled several organized binders along with digital storage containing synchronized footage, photographs, property logs, archived brochures, meeting announcements, planning exhibits, and witness statements gathered over months. Looking at the stack of carefully labeled material reminded me of my grandfather's filing cabinet. Piece by piece, patient records had become something impossible to dismiss. The legal process that followed moved much slower than neighborhood gossip ever had. Formal notices were exchanged. Survey records were verified again. Title documents were authenticated. The recorded covenant, its amendments, valuation schedules, and licensing provisions were reviewed alongside the homeowners association communications promoting organized access without authorization. Experts examined timelines. Witnesses explained how residents had been encouraged to believe community use had already been approved. Every document fit together with the next one like sections of an engineering blueprint. During one meeting, Maggie confidently insisted that everyone had merely misunderstood her intentions. Then one of the archived flyers appeared on the screen beside photographs of the entrance banners, promotional videos, neighborhood maps, and months of written communications. The room grew noticeably quieter. For the first time since this entire dispute began, she stopped speaking in polished slogans and started carefully rereading documents she had personally approved. I recognized that expression immediately because I had worn it myself years earlier while reviewing engineering reports after unexpected field inspections. It was the moment someone realizes the paperwork has stopped supporting the story they wanted to tell. As I gathered my notes at the end of that long day, I looked down at the same worn brown envelope my grandfather had labeled decades earlier. He had not left me a shortcut. He had left me instructions. Preserve the records. Stay patient. Let facts outlast assumptions. Standing there, I finally understood why he trusted paper more than arguments. Because arguments depend on memory. while carefully kept records continue speaking long after every loud voice has faded into silence. Several months have passed since that long series of meetings, filings, and carefully documented records finally reached their conclusion, and every time I drive through the new gate at the entrance to my lake, I still hear my grandfather's voice reminding me that paper remembers everything. The old chain that Maggie ordered cut now hangs inside my workshop, cleaned and mounted above the workbench beside the faded yellow legal pad he carried for decades. Some people collect trophies from victories. I kept a broken chain because it reminds me that the smallest object can become the beginning of the biggest lesson. The Homeowners Association eventually stopped advertising community access because the documents they had ignored spoke far louder than any neighborhood meeting ever could. The temporary signs disappeared. The colorful brochures quietly vanished. The online maps were corrected. New notices informed residents that the road and shoreline remained private property and that future access would require the owner's written authorization. Most of the families who had visited my lake that summer were never the problem. Many of them later stopped by simply to apologize after learning what had really happened. I invited a few to sit on the porch for coffee, and once they understood the full story, they admitted they had trusted information that turned out to be incomplete. I never held that against them. Good neighbors deserve honesty, and most people make decisions based on what they believe to be true. The real lesson was never about keeping people away from a beautiful lake. It was about respecting boundaries before someone decides they no longer matter. Maggie eventually left her position as Homeowners Association president after the dispute came to an end. I have no idea where life has taken her since then, and honestly, I do not spend much time wondering. Carrying resentment is far heavier than carrying a stack of property records. What stayed with me instead was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that patience accomplished what anger never could. I still maintain the same gravel road my grandfather built more than 50 years ago. Every spring I repair the dock, clear fallen branches from the trail, oil the hinges on the gate, and replace weathered signs before fishing season begins. Very little has changed, and that is exactly how I like it. On calm mornings, when mist rises slowly from the water and the only sound is a loon calling across the lake, it almost feels as though none of the conflict ever happened. Then I glance toward the filing cabinet inside the cabin and smile, because I know that every carefully labeled folder represents another promise kept. My grandfather believed that ownership was never measured by how loudly someone defended their land. It was measured by how responsibly they cared for it, and how carefully they preserved its history for the next generation. I understand that now more than ever. Looking back, I never won because I argued better than Maggie. I never won because I shouted louder or demanded revenge. I simply trusted facts, respected the process, and refused to abandon the truth even when the easier path would have been giving in. Sometimes justice arrives with flashing lights and dramatic headlines. Sometimes it arrives quietly inside an old envelope that has been waiting decades for the right person to open it. If there is one thing this experience taught me, it is that patience is not weakness. Preparation is not fear. And the strongest foundation you can ever build is one supported by honesty, careful records, and the willingness to let the truth speak for itself. I would genuinely like to know what you think after hearing this story. If you had been standing in my boots, would you have reacted immediately? Or would you have waited and let the facts tell the story the way I did? Share your thoughts in the comments because I always enjoy reading different perspectives. And if stories about perseverance, fairness, and standing up the right way are the kind of stories you enjoy, I hope you will consider subscribing and joining me for the next one. Until then, take care of the things that matter, keep your records organized, and never underestimate the quiet strength of doing the right thing even when nobody else sees it yet.